Welcome to the Secular Scriptures. I'm Gail. Today's reading is Genesis chapter 39 to 41 from the World English Bible, a free public domain translation of the Bible without which this study would not be possible. And it's a long one, just like Joseph's prison sentence. Assuming you are not imprisoned and are free to do so, I cordially invite you to stay through the entire video for some history, literary analysis, comparative mythology, and conflicts, contradictions, and controversies. This is a secular Bible study, which means there will be no proselytizing nor apologetics. I'm not a biblical scholar, I just love these stories. Now, take up your cup while I read about our rather dreamy friend Joseph. Genesis chapter 39. Joseph was brought down to Egypt. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the hand of the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. Yahweh was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. His master saw that Yahweh was with him, and that Yahweh made all that he did prosper in his hand. Joseph found favor in his sight. He ministered to him, and Potiphar made him overseer of his house and all that he had put into his hand. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. Yahweh's blessing was on all that he had in the house and in the field. He left all that he had in Joseph's hand. He didn't concern himself with anything except for the food which he ate. Joseph was well built and handsome. After these things, his master's wife set her eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, "Behold, my master doesn't know what is with me in the house, and he has put all that he has into my hand. No one is greater in this house than I am, and he has not kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" As she spoke to Joseph day by day, he didn't listen to her to lie by her or be with her. About this time he went into the house to do his work, and there were none of the men of the house inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." He left his garment in her hand and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had run outside, she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, "Behold, he has brought a Hebrew. I cannot see through your little body." When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had run outside, she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, "Behold, he has brought a Hebrew in to mock us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. When he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment by me and ran outside." She laid up his garment by her until his master came home. Genesis chapter 40. After all these things, the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. He put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he took care of them. They stayed in prison many days. They both dreamed a dream, each man with his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the cupbearer and the baker of Egypt, who were bound in the prison. Joseph came into them in the morning and saw them, and saw that they were sad. He asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" They said to him, "We have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it." Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Please tell it to me." The chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, behold, the vine was in front of me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, it blossomed, and the clusters produced ripe grapes. The Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand." Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. You will give Pharaoh's cup into his hand the way you did when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you. Please show kindness to me and make mention of me to Pharaoh and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that should put me into this dungeon." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also was in my dream, and behold, 3 baskets of white bread were on my head. In the uppermost basket there were all kinds of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. Joseph answered, This is the interpretation. 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days Pharaoh will lift up your head from off of you and will hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. On the 3rd day, I cannot see through your body. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer didn't remember Joseph, but forgot him. You are making an awful racket, Miss Bandit Cat. Genesis chapter 41. At the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. Behold, 7 cattle came up out of the river. They were sleek and fat, and they fed in the marsh grass. Behold, 7 other cattle came up after them out of the river, ugly and thin, and stood by the other cattle on the brink of the river. The ugly and thin cattle ate up the 7 sleek and fat cattle, so Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, healthy and good. Behold, 7 heads of grain, thin and blasted, with the east wind sprung up after them. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy and full ears. Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. In the morning his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all of Egypt's magicians and wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults today. Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard with the chief baker. We dreamed a dream in one night, he and I, each man, a dream according to the interpretation of his dream. There was with us a young man, a Hebrew servant, to the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. He interpreted to each man according to his dream. As he interpreted to us, so it was. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. He shaved himself, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It isn't in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood on the brink of the river, and behold, 7 fat and sleek cattle came up out of the river. They fed in the marsh grass, and behold, 7 other cattle came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for ugliness. The thin and ugly cattle ate up the first 7 fat cattle, and when they had eaten them up, it couldn't be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ugly as at the beginning, so I awoke. I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, full and good, and behold, 7 heads of grain, withered and thin, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 heads of grain. I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could interpret it to me. Joseph said to Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. What God is about to do, he has declared to Pharaoh. The 7 good cattle are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. The dream is one. The 7 thin and ugly cattle that came up after them are 7 years, and also the 7 empty heads of grain blasted with the east wind. They will be the 7 years of famine. That is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Behold, 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt are coming. 7 years of famine will arise after them, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. And plenty will not be known in the land by reason of that famine which follows, for it will be very grievous. The dream was doubled to Pharaoh, because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now, therefore, let Pharaoh look for a discreet and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint overseers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt's produce in the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that come, and store the grain under the hand of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food will be to supply the land against the 7 years of famine, which will be in the land of Egypt, so that the land will not perish through the famine. The thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Because God has shown you all of this, there is no one so discreet and wise as you. You shall be over my house. All of my people will be ruled according to your word. Only in the throne will I be greater than you." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in robes of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. He made him ride in the second chariot which he had. They cried before him, "Bow the knee." He set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh. Without you no man shall lift up his hand or his foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah, I think. He gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as a wife. Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. In the 7 plenteous years the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He stored the food in each city from the fields around that city. Could you sit? Joseph laid up the grains as the sand of the sea, very much until he stopped counting, for it was without number. To Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came, who Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all of my toil and all of my father's house." Manasseh sounds like Hebrew for forget. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And Ephraim sounds like the Hebrew word for twice fruitful. The 7 years of plenty that were in the land of Egypt came to an end. The 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph has said. There was famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, what he says to you do." The famine was over all the surface of the earth. Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. The famine was severe in the land of Egypt. All the countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all the earth. My, what a rollicking good tale. The bumper isn't going to fall off of this one. I love this little tale. Let's talk about it. History of the text. We have a little bit of a mishmash in terms of the attribution, dating, and origin of the text. The documentary hypothesis gives the 3 chapters to the following sources. Chapter 39 is assigned to the Yahwist source in the 900s BCE, Chapter 40 to the Elohist in the 800s, Chapter 41 goes to the Elohist and priestly sources in the 600s to 400s BCE. The supplementary hypothesis claims that while the core of the story dates to J and E, the final form was highly edited and put together in the post-exilic or Persian period in the 500s BCE. But more recent critical scholarship pushes the writing forward in time to the late Persian or early Hellenistic era in the 400s to 300s BCE, with edits as late as the 1st century BCE, due to the location's language and various narrative details compared to real-world timeline. As an example, Hebron being in the valley versus on the hilltop. Contemporary biblical scholars also point out that the older parts of the Bible don't reference Joseph's stay in Egypt at all. They posit that is because the story was written and or compiled around the same time as the book of Daniel, which is why we see it in the New Testament, but not so much in the Old Testament. Any way you shake it out, it wasn't written by Moses. I want to add a personal note here, learning about the documentary and supplementary hypothesis, and that modern scholarship is a thing, has been very healing for me. Literary analysis. Characters in order of appearance. Joseph gets 2 names here. It's amazing how people's names can change over their lifetimes, isn't it? Joseph, or Zapanath Paneah, in a speaking role. Potiphar, who does not speak. The Ishmaelites, Yahweh or God, who also does not speak but is just present. Potiphar's wife who speaks, the men of the house, the keeper of the prison, which may actually still be Potiphar. That's very confusing. The chief cupbearer and the chief baker, both in speaking roles. Pharaoh also in a speaking role. Magicians and wise men. Asenath, Potipharah, the priest of On, Manasseh, Ephraim, and the people of Egypt. Setting. The story is set in Egypt, probably between the 1700s and 1500s BCE. Point of view and style. It is told in the third-person omniscient point of view in the prose narrative style and is considered a short story or novella in its own right. Plot summary. Joseph gets sold into slavery, this time by the Ishmaelites, absolutely crushes it at his new job, escapes being essayed by his boss's wife, but catches a false rape accusation on the way out the door because he left evidence in her hand. He's thrown into prison and lands in middle management the moment his bottom hits the bottom step. He starts a side hustle in dream consulting and gets ghosted by his first client until 2 years later when he lands a top government position because the head honcho can't interpret grain and bovine-themed anxiety dreams without him. Oh, and our boy gets hitched. Never underestimate the power of networking, folks. Literary devices. Repetition. Joseph's story follows a pattern of enslavement, trust building, and rising to power, with each cycle having lower lows and higher highs. We also see him stripped before each one, and then he is given new clothing to fit his new role. Symbolism. As Joseph moves from one role to another, his clothing symbolizes those changes in his life. His clothes are also used to facilitate lies about him. His coat is used to lie to his father about his supposed death. His garment is used to lie to Potiphar about an attempted rape, and later we'll see his Egyptian official's clothing used to lie to his brothers as they do not recognize him. Within symbolism, we also have dream imagery with the fat and thin cows and grain representing years of plenty and years of famine. Contrast. While chapter 38 attempts to rehabilitate Judah in some ways, it also stands as a contrast in behavior between the two brothers, highlighting Joseph's good moral character in his refusal of Potiphar's wife in chapter 39 and literally running out naked to preserve his own honor, versus Judah shirking his social duty and condemning his daughter-in-law for engaging in the same behavior he eagerly engaged in. What a prick. One woman stands with false evidence in her hand, while the other stands with real evidence that saved her life. We also have the theme of reversal of fortune, where Joseph goes from slavery and prison to positions of power and responsibility. Comparative mythology. There are 3 main story elements here: the scorned woman, prophetic dreams, and rags to riches. The Greek tragedy of Hippolytus and Phaedra closely aligns with the plot of Potiphar's wife and Joseph. Phaedra falls in love with her stepson Hippolytus, and being a devotee of the goddess Artemis, he has sworn virginity and rejects her advances. Either under a curse from Aphrodite or out of her own spitefulness, Phaedra accuses Hippolytus of rape, and his father Theseus uses a wish from Poseidon to kill him. Poseidon obliges by frightening Hippolytus's horses, who drag him to his death. Phaedra hangs herself in remorse, and on learning the truth, Theseus grieves their deaths. The Joseph narrative is also widely considered to be a partial retelling of the Egyptian Tale of Two Brothers, dating to the 1200s BCE, which, having just read it, let me tell ya, there is not enough brain bleach on the face of the planet to get that spot out. So, if you'd like to go read it yourself, have at it. Full warning. But essentially it mirrors the unfaithful wife, a split in the household alliances, and a poor man becoming a ruler in Egypt, with about 10 times the gore involved in Joseph's story and the requisite shape-shifting and defeat of death in many Egyptian tales. Conflicts, contradictions, and controversies. Conflicting information within the text. Suddenly, we're back to the Ishmaelites selling Joseph in Egypt, Genesis 39:1. Except, weren't they the Midianites before we went on that whole Judah and Tamar adventure? Genesis 37, verse 36. Depending on which verse you are reading, Joseph is either pulled out of the pit by the Midianite traders or sold to the Ishmaelites by his brothers. Then somehow these different groups managed to sell each of him in Egypt. Twice the price, right? That's a whole lot of little brother Joe trading hands. It reads like two versions of the same story stitched together because that's exactly what it is. Then there's Potiphar. Is he just the captain of the guard, or is he also the keeper of the prison? Genesis 39 verse 22 versus Genesis 40 verse 3. Because when Joseph is imprisoned, the lines between who's running what get blurry. To keep with the theme of Joseph taking over administrative duties from the captain to the keeper to Pharaoh as a narrative pattern, we should understand them to be separate people. But that middle section is very blurry, and some people interpret the two titles as belonging to the same person, and others say they are separate people. The text, alas, is not exactly clear, though some translations are more definitive than others. Conflicting information within the religion or society. We gotta talk about who gets to marry who. On one hand, later traditions heavily emphasize maintaining religious and cultural separation, especially when it comes to marriage. Think back to Dinah and Shechem and how that story evolved over time from one like this, where Dinah marries the handsome prince, to one of rape and revenge, where the non-Israelite is unwelcome, brutish, and deserves death. In fact, Joseph's story is almost a perfect opposite mirror of the evolution of Dinah's tale, between his happily ever after marriage to escaping Potiphar's wife. While Joseph marries the daughter of the priest of On, better known as Heliopolis, was a major center of sun worship devoted to the god Ra. Joseph isn't just marrying outside the group, he's marrying directly into the family of a high-ranking pagan religious figure, and yet this is perfectly acceptable. Was it because he was a slave being given a wife? I doubt that. She wasn't a slave. She was the daughter of a priest. Did he have the ability to consent? That question always hangs in there, doesn't it? Legally, yes, but in practice, it's hard to say. The Pharaoh is the one who told him he had to marry this woman. The tale implies that they were happy. There is a tradition, which I mentioned in Dinah's story, that Joseph's wife is Dinah and Shechem's daughter, adopted by the priest and his wife. So Joseph isn't really marrying outside of Israel. He's marrying his half-sister's daughter? Yay? But we have to back up a few steps and talk about the issue of sexism, because of course we do. Oh my God. Women in this section largely function as plot devices, especially Potiphar's wife, whose role exists almost entirely to create conflict for Joseph. Her voice, motives, and perspective aren't explored beyond what the story needs her to be, though her story is expanded in Islamic tradition, where she does actually end up marrying Joseph later on in life. They do a decent job of redeeming her. She's still honestly kind of shallow. And if you are interested, you should check it out. Unfortunately, some other stories are even meaner to her, saying that Joseph wasn't the first male slave she had done this to, and she intended to see him killed for refusing her. Go read those too, but only if you like ancient toxic horror. Contradictions in the text. Not to beat a dead camel, but the Ishmaelites and Midianites passing Joseph back and forth like a game of desert hot potato isn't just a small detail. It's a classic example of how multiple source traditions were combined. Instead of choosing one version, the redactors of the text chose to preserve both. That makes the story feel messy and caused poor 7-year-old me no end of trouble with my pastor when I pointed it out. But it also gives us a glimpse into how these texts were compiled and preserved, and where the authors placed importance on preserving tradition over narrative consistency. Gavin Ortlund just came out with a video on inerrancy, and while I personally think the Bible is far better if we chuck that concept in the compost heap and forget it ever existed, he does point out that it's important to understand the type of literature we are reading and what the goals of the authors were in telling these tales. It is not necessary to decide who sold Joseph into Egypt. It was more important to honor each tradition by mentioning the variations. And we get so many fun fanfic opportunities here, don't waste them. Contradictions with society and science. Tell me your dreams! From a modern scientific perspective, dreams are understood to be neurological processes, a type of thought linked to memory, emotions, and cognition. And while we don't entirely understand all of their purposes, dreams are thought to help in memory formation and planning, but they are not reliable predictors of future events. Though dream interpretation books still sell like hotcakes, and it was only a few decades ago when a psychologist asked me about my own dreams and totally bungled the interpretation and meaning because he was basing that on his life experience, not mine. I also grew up in a family that believed in prophetic dreams, and I will often think about my dreams to see if Sleeping Gal came up with anything good. In the story, Joseph has and interprets prophetic dreams, giving credit to Yahweh, of course, and his ability to interpret dreams lets him gain social status and political power, except for the first two, which got him dumped in a hole. In the ancient world, dreams were seen as legitimate channels of divine communication, and that is still true today. Entire systems of dream interpretation existed in Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia. In Joseph's time, dreams and visions were how societies made important decisions. Modern research in neuroscience and psychology doesn't support the idea that dreams predict the future. Instead, dreams are generally understood as the brain processing information, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, and pattern recognition. Your brain is sorting, filing, and literally stress testing scenarios while you sleep, or sometimes it's throwing up massive amounts of silliness like mine does. That doesn't mean that dreams are unimportant. They are critical to our well-being. If we don't dream, we get sick. Dreams are important for the individual person. They are not predictors of future events. But do tell me in the comments if you have had a prophetic dream or two. Controversies. We need to talk about Potiphar's wife, slavery, and power dynamics, and the use of false rape accusations. In the story, Joseph refuses the unnamed woman's advances, and she accuses him of assaulting her out of anger, and he, as the slave, suffers the consequences for a thing he did not do. This narrative specifically has been abused very intentionally to magnify false accusations and silence victims. Statistically, false accusations of rape are rare. Most studies place them in the low single digits, somewhere under 5%, while others bump it closer to 10%. The overwhelming majority of sexual assaults are either unreported or difficult to prosecute, often due to lack of evidence or failure to process what evidence is collected. As to false imprisonment for sexual assault, it is unfortunately true that somewhere around 10% of people convicted of SA are sitting in jail for crimes they did not commit. Factors include flawed procedures, false confessions, and misidentification. If someone didn't see their assailant, this can easily happen, especially with police pressure. My own uncle, who was totally a thief, was threatened with a rape conviction that the judge knew he didn't do if he didn't fess up to the crime he did do. And yes, he's probably still in jail somewhere where he belongs. So, while the story of Potiphar's wife presents a false accusation as an exciting and novel plot point, using it as a cudgel to silence real-world SA victims is quite frankly insane. And unfortunately, it is very, very common. These verses aren't the only tool in the playbook to help predators get away with their crimes, but it's a big one. As a slave, Joseph has limited legal ability to defend himself against someone in a higher social position, though being in Egypt, it wasn't none as in some other nations. As I mentioned before, one version of the tale claims that Potiphar's wife did this to several other slaves before Joseph and enjoyed watching them being executed, which is more in line with Israelite customs than Egyptian customs. This was the fate that she intended for the hero of our tale, but fortunately for him, things didn't go that badly. Stepping back into the real world, I want to be careful not to downplay the prevalence of female-to-male SA, which is severely underreported. It happens more than most people think. About 20% of reported male SA was perpetrated by women. And there is often an element of social power involved, like female prison guards assaulting male prisoners, female teachers assaulting male students, etc. As we see in this story, the female head of house tried to use her power to abuse her husband's slave. Potiphar's wife is the untouchable, high-ranking woman whose social connections and money protect her from her own bad deeds. And she suffers no consequences for her actions, at least not that we see in the text. She treats Joseph as an object rather than as a person, a common affliction among the ultra-wealthy regardless of sex or gender. People are not playthings, and slavery is wrong. So, believe victims when they tell you what happened, and quit thinking that people are making stuff up, because chances are they aren't. Also, men are SA'd at almost the same rate as women, but it's usually by other men. But it's more women than most people think. Shame all around here. Ring the shame bell. Channel recommendations. The Inquisitive Bible Reader, Joseph, the History of a Jewish Novella. Highly recommend. Questions. Does the Ishmaelite versus Midianite contradiction bother you, or does it make the history of the text more interesting? If you were taught biblical inerrancy, how do you reconcile this and other contradictions? Why do you think societies put so much importance on dream interpretation? How do you feel about Joseph? If you had to predict your future based on the last dream you had, what would it be? Because the last dream I had involved fluffy yellow googly-eyed mice creatures hopping around a puppet stage to kids' music. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me while I quite frankly obsessed over these characters and their motivations. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, please like, subscribe, share, do the bell thing, and leave your comments below. I do read them and try to respond. I hope you'll join me next Sunday at 9 a.m. for Christianity as a Pantheon.